In a world like Squid Game that kills hundreds of innocent lives purely for the sake of entertainment, why are people still praying to God? Can a God truly exist in a world like this? And if there is a God, what type of God is it? Is there multiple or just one? Does this existence of God or gods have any implications that change the very fabric of how we see the Squid Game narrative? Well, surprisingly enough, there's actually a pretty strong case for God's existence that answers every single one of these questions, ranging from softer narrative clues to hard cold facts, supported by the creator himself. The first thing that might be brought to mind when thinking of the idea of God in the Squid Game verse is probably the VIPs. In a world that is completely devoid of all forms of consequences for the elite, it would seem that the intentions of these figures is to act as the gods of the verse and of the games themselves. People like Nam stand above the clouds, pulling the strings of the events in the lives of the peasants standing below the heavens. Their existence alone seems to be a statement that the only gods in that world are those with enough money to dictate everything. But the thing is, the show actually contradicts this notion, because of the fact that one of these gods falls victim to a brain tumor, proving that the rich are no less susceptible to misfortune than the poor. It turns out these elite aren't actually gods, they just play God. But obviously this just proves that the VIPs aren't gods of Squid Game. But that doesn't exactly prove the existence of God yet, does it? But what if I told you that there are some events that happen in Squid Game that actually make the case for there being a God in Squid Game a bit stronger? Although it isn't the strongest evidence of there being a higher power above even the VIPs themselves, the fact that the same brain that came up with the idea of the Squid Game is the same brain that just so happens to get a tumor in it does seem like some form of divine judgment. Another bit of weaker evidence could be the tragic tale of Player 244. This former pastor's character is basically defined by his belief in God, with the show using him as one of the vehicles for criticizing organized religion. One of the ways that the show seems to do this is by showing that his faith in God couldn't prevent his own death, but a closer look reveals the fact that Player 244's faith only fails him when he actually kills someone with his bare hands. Sure, the show often brings up the hypocrisy of the former pastor being so high and mighty when he technically is responsible for the deaths of all of the people who had to die for him to move on. But those deaths are technically not his fault. He did not kill the players in Red Light, Green Light, Honeycombs, or Ganbu. All he did was win. The only players he actually had a hand in physically killing were the opposing tug-of-war team, but even then, his hand was forced. But in Glass Bridge, he killed someone even though he had the choice to avoid it. If we were to view sins as crime in the court of law, this would be his first real offense. On top of that, in a game based on luck, he actually showed little faith in God, because if he actually had faith, he would have trusted that God would show him the path forward. And then naturally, he immediately dies after these transgressions. However, a skeptic could destroy these claims by just writing them off as simply being coincidences that happened out of pure consequence. The risk of brain tumors could be a result of lifestyle choices, so Nam's tumor could be his own poor decisions coming back to bite him. And Player 244 was ultimately killed by the friend of the player that Player 244 pushed to his death, so his fate can simply be seen as an immediate consequence to being a terrible person. So although you could interpret these events as God's judgment, there's also equally a strong case for a more karmic interpretation. If this is true, we can't say for sure if Squid Game has a God, because this evidence alone could just be as likely written off by a more simple explanation. So if we even want to consider the possibility of there being a God, we're gonna need something a little bit more convincing. Luckily for us, our search for God doesn't end here, because Player 044, another religious-based character, gives us much stronger evidence that might just be what we need to make God's existence more believable. For starters, Player 044 says that Player 456 had lived longer than he was supposed to, and that he was brought back for another purpose. If we were to take her statement at face value, then it would imply that there was an original script that had been rewritten. For there to be a rewritten script, there would have to be a writer to rewrite that script, and that writer would be God. dead. But hey, that's just one prediction. Maybe it was a coincidence that Gi-hun sacrificed himself for 222's baby. For all we know, Gi-hun's fate being rewritten might have just been nonsense from a crazy lady, making the existence of God, yet again, difficult to prove. But fortunately for us, player 044's feats and statements later on prove her statements are more credible than they might seem on the surface, strengthening the case for God's existence once more. And that's because this shaman of the sea says that the gods are leading her during hide and seek, and even shows signs of this theological guidance when she gives even more prophecies of the future. Again, these pieces of evidence alone don't prove anything, but the fact that all of her specific prophecies come true, and the fact that her having the ability to see the future is confirmed by the creator of the show himself, means that her being led by God holds more weight. If player 044 says that she is led by the gods of heaven and earth with her visions, and her very specific visions all come true as confirmed by the creator in the show itself, then God has to be real. But of course, it's also important to note that there are some counter arguments available that serve to completely destroy the credibility of this notion. You could argue that maybe her visions might be from a different source other than God. After all, player 044 does mention the spirits hanging over Gi-hun, so maybe she might be mistaking God's guidance by that of spirits or demons. But that logically wouldn't make any sense, because how would regular spirits have access to the level of information that would allow them to know future events? The only one that would be able to know the type of stuff that is going to be on the script is the one writing the script himself. That is, of course, if you're going to assume that player 044 just has the power to see the future all by herself, in which case she would be God, but her powers are described by the creator as shamanistic powers, implying that they are directly derived from being a shaman. So clearly her visions are as if she's receiving radio signals from the gods, as believed by the followers of the Korean religion of Muism. But whether this God actually exists in the capacity that is believed in the Muism faith is something that can't be confirmed yet. We were able to identify that God has to be the one giving her the visions, but that would only make player 044 the receiver of the revelations. So there's no evidence that she would actually see where the actual visions are coming from. For all we know, Squid Game could have a Christian God like player 244 believed in, or there could even be multiple gods. But I think one of the most interesting implications of there being an omniscient God in the Squid Game verse is the fact that it implies that there is an afterlife. This means that when Gi-hun died after he lost the Squid Game in season 3, he was actually able to receive something that winning the Squid Game in season 1 wasn't able to give him: a chance to see his mother one last time. Thanks for watching.